Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the seminar. So this seminar is hosted by the Campaign for Social Sciences and also Access. So my name is Birgitta Gatersleben. I'm Professor of Environmental Psychology at the University of Surrey, and I'm co-director of Access. And Access stands for Advancing Capacity of Climate and Environmental Social Science, and is a 5-year investment. And the aim of Access really is to champion environmental social science. And this is very much similar to the remit, really, of what the Campaign for Social Sciences is doing, although it's not specifically, I guess, related to environmental social science specifically. But the Campaign for Social Science really aims to demonstrate and support the value of social science in policy and interdisciplinary research. And today's seminar is part of the Election 24 campaign of the Campaign for Social Science, which aims to demonstrate and support the value that social science could have for the next government, whatever that may look like. And I think there's more information that will appear in the chat where you can find out more about both Access, also the Campaign for Social Sciences and the Election 24 project. So today's seminar focuses really on one of the major social challenges that we're facing today, climate change. Climate change obviously is very much a social science issue. We need social transformation in order to tackle that big challenge. So today's seminar is very much about that. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Lorraine Whitmarsh, Professor of Environmental Psychology at the University of Bath, who is very much an expert in this field. Lorraine leads the CAST, the Center of, I will read this out so I get it right, the Center for Climate Change and Social Transformation. And I think there's also more information in the chat, a link to the CAST Center, so you can find out more about that as well. So as I said, Lorraine is very much an expert in this field. She regularly advises government and other organizations on behavior change, social transformation, and climate change communication. She's a lead author of an IPCC Working Group 2, the 6th assessment report. She's done a huge amount of very valuable and exciting work in this field. So Lorraine will talk about this work on behavior change, policy choices to support social action and challenge climate change issues. And if you have any questions, can you please put them in the Q&A? We will not be able to, well, I can't see any of you, so we will not be able to answer any of your questions. So please pop them in the Q&A and we'll keep track of any questions that are there. And then we'll try and answer or address as many of the questions as we possibly can towards the end. But for now, I guess I will hand over to Lorraine, who will share her screen and tell us more about her work. Lorraine, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, Birgitta, and it's really lovely to be with you today. Just put my slides up for you. So yes, I'll be talking about behavior change and the climate emergency. And this is obviously, the context of this is that almost every month we are breaking new climate records. So February was the warmest and wettest on record. It still continues to rain an awful lot, and we are almost becoming used to extremes of weather on a day-to-day basis. And of course, in this country, we're not really experiencing the worst of climate change. These are effects that are being felt around the world, often much more severely than we have been. In order to tackle the climate crisis, nothing short of societal transformation is required. This is what we know from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that assesses climate science, that we need to be reaching net zero emissions, so essentially sort of carbon neutral by the middle of the century. And in the UK, our Climate Change Act commits us to cutting our emissions by 78% in just over a decade, which is a huge feat. And the UK government's climate advisors, the Committee on Climate Change, tell us that we're not on track nationally, that we are lagging where we should be in terms of cutting our carbon emissions, that we've made good progress from decarbonising our energy supply, moving away gradually from fossil fuels to more renewable and low carbon sources. But we've made very little progress when it comes to actually decarbonising demand, that is how we use energy and resources. And that's really where the people bit comes in a lot more obviously. So this is why there's a need for social science to understand that. And let's take a look at the UK's net zero strategy. This is our key piece of climate policy that we have in this country. There was a forward from the Prime Minister in the latest version of this strategy in 2021, where he says, for years, going green was explicably bound up with a sense that we have to sacrifice things we love. But this strategy shows we can build back better without a hair shirt in sight. In 2050, we'll be driving cars, flying planes, heating our homes, but our cars will be electric, gliding silently around the cities. Our planes will be zero emission, allowing us to fly guilt-free. Our homes will be heated by cheap, reliable power drawn from the North Sea. So there's a real faith in technology that is very much explicit in the forward, but does carry through a lot of the strategy itself, and indeed through a lot of climate and energy policy that we have in this country. And there is a downplaying of the need for social and behavioural change. Here it's quite explicit that there is an assumption that actually people don't want to change their behaviour and the government won't need to at all get people to change their lifestyles. Well, how realistic is this? In fact, what we know from the IPCC, but also the Committee on Climate Change and the House of Lords and numerous other reports now, is that technological change by itself is not going to be enough to enable us to reach our carbon targets. Most of the measures that we need to reach net zero in the UK will require at least some degree of behaviour change. A third of emission reductions will come from consumer behaviour change alone. And so that is from buying, say, electric vehicles, heat pumps, green technologies, using less energy wherever possible. And the scale of that change actually is quite profound. If we were aiming to keep warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, which is now looking extremely unlikely, we are pretty much at 1.5 degrees now, we would be reducing the average UK carbon footprint from about 8 tonnes to 2.5 tonnes by just the end of this decade. So in the next 6 or so years, which is an enormous transformation in lifestyles. Let's take a look at the sorts of behaviour changes we're talking about. This is from work by the CREDS Centre. They've quantified the carbon savings that can come from different behaviour changes, and the circles that you see sort of in the middle there with the numbers in tells us how many tonnes of CO2 can be saved by these different things. So you would save 2 tonnes of carbon if you lived car-free. You'd save about 1 2/3 of a tonne of carbon if you took 1 less flight a year. You would save 0.8 tonnes if you adopted a vegan diet, and so on. So across these different behaviours, you can see many of them relate to transport, some relate to energy use, some relate to diet. And by contrast, recycling, if you recycled all the things you possibly could recycle, that would save about 0.01 tonnes of CO2 per year. So it's worth doing. It is worth recycling, I should emphasise, but it is disproportionately more effective in reducing your carbon footprint by doing some of these other things. And it is worth saying, of course, not everybody has to change to the same extent. Actually, the biggest predictor of people's carbon footprint is income. So income goes up the more money you earn in general, and such that the wealthiest 10% have a carbon footprint more than double the national average and more than 4 times that of people at the lower end of the income distribution. And you can dig into the data and see that actually the emissions are coming from potentially different sorts of things. So those on the highest income are potentially flying a lot more, whereas those on the lowest incomes are just basically heating their homes primarily. That's the main thing that their carbon footprint is going towards. And of course, people have different abilities to change. It's worth saying that as well. If you live in a rural area, you may not have the public transport or cycling infrastructure that people in towns and cities may do. People with disabilities, people from different income and gender groups and so on may face different sorts of barriers and have different opportunities. So the public as a whole is, of course, very varied, but we do all have to change to at least some degree. The other point is that actually, in a lot of the discussions about what people can do to tackle climate change, people are often reduced to being just consumers. That is to say, they can adopt an electric car, for example, or they can adopt a heat pump. They can buy things that would reduce their carbon emissions directly. So they reduce their own carbon footprint. And of course, that's a really important role that people can play. They can directly reduce their own carbon emissions. But there are other things that people can do as well that are often not necessarily talked about. That includes being a citizen, that we can actually use our voting power, very relevant at the moment. We can vote for parties that we think might do more on climate change, for example, or we can protest. We can actually actively engage in activism or write to our political representatives to voice our concerns. We can use our money and invest in greener products. And actually, that's thought to be one of the most effective things that you can do is to invest in a green pension plan and green investments, that it's more effective, for example, than going vegan. Other things that you can do are around influencing other people. So actually you're a role model. So everything that you do, every action that you take sends a signal really to the people around you that this is something that you think is important or is worth doing. And so when you adopt a low carbon behavior, you're signaling that this is something that that is right for you, that you want to do, and that can help to start to change social norms. And so in our communities, in the sorts of groups that we might engage with, we're just starting to look at football fans, for example. There's a huge opportunity there to get people together to look at how to influence one another. And of course, we're members of organizations very often. We may be employees or employers. There are things that we can do within the workplace that can have potentially enormous impacts depending on the level of influence that we have at work. So there are choices that we can make across a range of contexts that actually mean that people can be very active in the transition to net zero. The good news is, I suppose, that actually the public is already quite engaged with climate change. There has been growing concern about climate change in recent decades, and particularly in the last few years. And at the moment, over 4 in 5 people in the UK say they're concerned about climate change. That wasn't dented by COVID. It's not particularly been dented by the cost of living crisis. We still see that people are worried about climate change, despite also being worried about other things too. And we also see that people want to play a part in tackling climate change. They feel broadly that if they're not taking action to combat climate change, they will be failing future generations. By contrast, there is a sense that government is not doing enough. So the data on the left here, this pie chart, comes from some hot off the press data that we've just released with the Grantham Institute, where we polled the UK public, a representative sample, to ask, amongst other things, over the last 12 months, do you think the UK government has done enough to reduce carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions to help prevent climate change? And about 2/3 say the government is doing too little, and only 6% say they're doing too much. So there's a clear sense, really, that the public is frustrated that government is not doing more. And that's also important, actually, in terms of people's well-being. There's some interesting evidence around climate anxiety, that particularly amongst young people, climate anxiety does seem to be higher than amongst older age groups. One study by colleagues at Bath found that 45% of young people around the world said that their worries about climate change were impacting on their day-to-day functioning. So a sense of climate anxiety was negatively impacting their well-being. But also this research found that this distress, this climate distress, was significantly related to a perceived failure by governments to respond to the climate crisis. So particularly amongst young people who may not yet be able to vote, there is a real sense of kind of feeling disempowered, and yet knowing that the worst of the impacts are going to be obviously coming in the future as they grow up. And this huge sort of sense of loss of hope that some of them are feeling is directly linked to a sense that governments are not doing enough to look after them. And on the other hand, we also see that the public are broadly supportive of many of the sorts of net zero policies that governments could implement. So some of the policies that we've looked at in some recent work in collaboration with Ipsos, the polling company, we polled the UK public, a very large sample of over 5,500 people in 2021, and then we followed up in 2022. We're about to do the same poll again. And we asked about various climate policies. You can see them briefly mentioned here. In each case, we described what these policies involved. So, for example, frequent flyer levies, we explained that this would mean that if you took, the more flights you took each year, the more tax you would pay on those flights. So that if you only took, say, one flight a year, you would pay little or no tax on that flight, but it would go up the more flying you did. And as you look down, you can see there's other things like phasing out gas boilers, electric vehicles subsidies, low traffic neighbourhoods, higher taxes on red meat and dairy. And in all cases, actually, we find that there is more support than opposition. And in almost all cases, there's majority support. It's only the higher taxes on red meat and dairy that doesn't quite get to 50%. And we know that just saying the word tax tends to decrease support. So if we'd called it something else, we might have just about got over the 50% mark. This is really important because all of these policies would imply behaviour change. And so what we're seeing here is that actually the public is, again, saying, well, we would be willing to change our behaviour actually under the right circumstances. So, and there is, we can actually see that some of these policies are more supported than others. And that might speak to the fact that things like frequent flyer levies, and the second one down, which is around changing product pricing to reflect environmental impacts, you pay more for higher polluting products and less for lower polluting products. These things embed the polluter pays principle. And I think that's relevant because when you break down support for these various policies that we asked about, so this is the same data, but just now you can see how it breaks down according to different voter groups within the UK public. So Conservative voters, blue, Labour voters, red, Lib Dems, yellow, and the green bars are the average, the totals. And there is disagreement in some cases. So broadly speaking, those on the right of centre politically are rather less in favour than those on the left. But why I've highlighted frequent flyer levies and changing product pricing is because actually in this case, you've got a majority of all voter groups are in support of these two policies. So you've got sort of a reasonable level of agreement actually that these might be positive. And again, I think it does come down to the fact that there is an element of fairness embedded here in this sort of polluter pays principle. That I think that's part of why we see support here. And also, it's worth saying I didn't want to present all the statistics we did here, but what we have published that sort of shows why certain groups support certain policies and others do not. Fairness was the single biggest predictor of support across all these policies. So the more fair someone sees a policy, the more they are likely to support it. So that's an important point. So if fairness is important to the public in terms of driving, or at least in part driving their support for climate policies, how can we make climate policies fairer? Fairness captures different aspects. One of them is about distribution, and that's sort of who pays and making sure that people are not left behind, and making sure the polluter pays, for example. But also there is procedural fairness, which is important, which is about giving people a say in decisions that affect them. And we know that all of these types of this fairness are relevant in terms of people's judgments of policies. And when it comes to actually giving people a say, the work that we've been doing, and many others too, has shown that participatory policy making, so giving people a more substantive voice in policy making, not only leads to fairer outcomes, which people are more likely to support, but actually tends to improve the quality of decision making, because you're listening to more diverse views and values and types of expertise, and you can actually take account of the potential barriers that people might face when policies are implemented. It's also important to build in engagement and citizen engagement, because that helps build the political mandate for action. So it can help empower policymakers to feel that they have the public support if the public has been engaged and listened to and brought with them on the decision making. But that's all sort of I think that's all well and good to sort of show the public is broadly on board with many of the things that we need to do to get to net zero. But we do know that there is a gap between people's concern about climate change, which is very high, and their behaviour at the moment, because emissions continue to rise post-COVID. And the reason for that is that there are lots of barriers to behaviour change. And so we need to think about how to remove those barriers when we design behaviour change interventions. So broadly speaking, we categorise these interventions into two types, downstream versus upstream. Downstream is where you're directly influencing people's decision making, their attitudes and their understanding of the issue. And you can do that through informational approaches very often, so labelling, advertising, information campaigns, formal education, using kind of social influence approaches. All of these things are trying to get people to think differently about the issue and therefore decide to do something differently. The upstream approach is where you're trying to influence the context in which people act. That might be about changing the prices of different products, so using economic measures to raise the cost of polluting products, for example, or changing the availability of products and services. That might be through so-called nudging, where you're trying to change the choice environment so that certain choices are more accessible, easier to adopt, that they might be the default choice in some cases, or regulation where you're completely removing a set of choices available to people. And changing the built environment, the actual physical structures around us to enable people to change their behaviour. So design of cities, buildings, and so on. There is an intuitive understanding, there is an intuitive assumption, I think, that giving people information will get them to change their behaviour. But the evidence suggests that actually information by itself tends not to be very effective. A recent meta-analysis of ways of changing people's environmental behaviours showed that information by itself was only about 2 to 3% effective. Whereas upstream measures, depending on the type of measure, if it's regulation, for example, that might be up to 100% effective in some cases. And I'll give you some examples in a minute. But the caveat here is not to say that we don't need to give people information. It's to say that we can't rely on information alone to change behaviour. But if what we're trying to do, going back to the multiple roles that people have, is to get people to support wider social change, and for example, some of these upstream measures, we do need to engage with people. We need these more kind of downstream information provision type approaches to be part of how we engage people to enable support for upstream measures. We know a lot as well about how to give people information effectively. So given that we know information is not very effective, there are ways in which we can make it a bit more effective. We can target information gaps. So I mentioned already that recycling is not very effective compared to other things. We know that people think that recycling is far more effective than it actually is. They tend to underestimate how effective dietary change is, for example. There's not good awareness of the importance of reducing red meat and dairy. Information is more effective when it targets the place and time of action, when and where somebody is making a decision. That could be putting a label on a product, for example, in a supermarket, or putting a sticker on a light switch. But communication is also most effective when it targets what people care about. This is the basics of marketing and advertising. Actually, craft your message to target what a group of people are particularly interested in. And that might be about saving time or money. It might be about being healthy or helping their community, spending time with family. And so experiments that have tested ways in which to communicate environmental policies and measures that have emphasized some of these more immediate benefits that people could experience tend to find that they are more effective than when they just talk about environmental benefits. And the good news, that we know this from the IPCC's latest assessment, is that most of the things that we can do to tackle climate change can benefit us in these more immediate ways. So walking and cycling and eating less red meat and dairy are healthy. They're healthier choices in general. We can create green jobs and reduce energy bills by some of the things that we can do to tackle climate change as well. And again, from the latest polling that we've done with the Grantham Institute, we asked the UK public how important these co-benefits are to you. So these are benefits that we know would also come from tackling climate change. And what you can see here is that actually all of the benefits that we asked about are of importance to the public, and they do vary a little bit. So the ones that seem to be most important are about homes that are more affordable to heat. So a large majority very interested in that at the moment. And I think there might be a takeaway there in terms of thinking about policies that might be win-wins around kind of insulating to reduce emissions as well as to reduce energy bills. But the arrows there also highlight where there are impacts on health and well-being as well. So that's definitely an area where people are very interested in the co-benefits, and they also happen to be the co-benefits that are most well evidenced from climate mitigation. One other point around these sort of wider benefits is that actually I wanted to really make an explicit argument against the assumption that going green is about sacrifice. This was the statement that was really made in the net zero strategy forward, because there is now overwhelming evidence that people with greener lifestyles tend to have higher well-being. We've found this in a study not long ago where we looked across lots of different countries, and we found a positive relationship between well-being and people's pro-environmental actions that they were taking. And they were very diverse actions. So we were sort of capturing a lot of things that people can do around the sorts of roles that I talked about earlier. So really, this does suggest that actually going green is not about sacrifice. In actual fact, far from it, it may even improve people's quality of life. So by not thinking about tackling demand and getting people to change their lifestyles and change wider sort of social practices in our climate policies, we are actually missing out on the opportunity to improve well-being and quality of life. And I think that's quite profound. In some of the work that we're doing, we're really trying to emphasise some of these co-benefits. So this is work we're doing with Scottish Government, where we're trying to see how better to communicate the benefits of car use reduction. So we've identified a number of so-called sort of pen portraits, these kind of exemplar types of people that are changing their behaviour, and we've constructed narratives, little stories, and got some nice visuals commissioned to try to illustrate that changing behaviour, specifically reducing car use, is desirable, but also possible, that people like you are making these changes. But to just come back to the point about the limits of information, I mentioned that information by itself is not very effective to change behaviour. So we need to change the context in which people are acting. You can do that through lots of ways, and nudging has got a lot of attention. Nudges, on average, where you're changing the sort of choice architecture, but you're allowing people still freedom of choice, so you're not actually banning things, for example, are on average 25% effective, according to that meta-analysis that I mentioned. And two examples I particularly like. One of them was where they increased the number of vegetarian options in canteens. Previously, it had been 1 in 4. They increased it to 2 in 4, so you could still choose 2 meat options. That increased plant-based sales by up to 80%. And another one that was even more impressive was where a Swiss energy company moved 250,000 of their customers onto a renewable energy tariff by default. So they didn't have to opt in to get the renewable tariff. And actually, this renewable tariff cost them slightly more than the fossil fuel one. But nevertheless, almost all of those people just stayed on that renewable tariff. So about 90% of them nearly were still on that tariff 4 years later. Whereas when they had to opt in to get that tariff, only 3% did that. And this kind of highlights that nudging can be quite effective in certain cases to really just make it easier for people to do the right thing, the thing that they would say that they want to do, but maybe it's just the extra effort to change their energy supplier, for example, or their energy tariff means that they don't get around to it. But nudging is not the silver bullet. It can work in some contexts, but it doesn't work in all contexts. And the obvious one is that it doesn't necessarily work is transport, in that, for example, you can't nudge somebody onto a bus service that doesn't exist in their area. So you have to intervene more directly by, for example, changing the physical infrastructure, by reallocating road space, for example, giving some of the road space that used to be for cars to cyclists, pedestrians, or public transport. That can reduce car use by 22% on average, but sometimes very much more. And congestion charging is found to be one of the most effective ways of cutting car use. So that's cut car use in London by up to 33%. And these are just two examples of very many sorts of course, wider policies that could be applied to try to change people's behaviours. And it is also worth saying it matters when to intervene. Habits are a major barrier to lifestyle change. And so a lot of interventions, particularly informational ones, it's worth saying, but maybe economic ones to some extent, are not necessarily very effective because people that their habits sort of override the considering alternatives. Whereas when habits are disrupted or weakened, and this might be during sort of moments of change, as we call them, sort of life transition events, for example, moving house, or it could be having a baby or retiring, COVID we've also looked at, but there are times when habits are just significantly disruptive, and these provide great opportunities to more effectively intervene to get people to change their behaviour. So in one study, they gave residents who had recently moved house some information about their local bus service and a one-day pass to try the bus for free. And they found that over doubled bus use, whereas those people who had not recently relocated, this same intervention was not significantly effective. So the same intervention applied really only worked for people that had recently moved house. So it really matters when we intervene. So there's another sort of element to thinking about interventions as well. So just bringing this all together then, what I've tried to emphasize is how crucial radical social and behavioural change is for reaching net zero. And I've not really talked about adapting to climate impacts, but many of the same messages I think apply there as well. How can we achieve this? We need to focus on those high impact behaviours that I mentioned, like mobility, food, energy, and not only on what people can do to directly reduce their carbon emissions, but also to engage people more widely within the workplace, within political and community contexts, and so on. We need to co-design interventions with people. So the more we can engage people and bring people with us in the course of designing policies, the more likely they are to seem to be fairer, but also probably to work more effectively and therefore to be more acceptable. And we need to talk about the wider benefits of these sorts of policies as well, those co-benefits I mentioned. So saving energy, improving health, for example. We need to combine upstream and downstream interventions, because we know that downstream information by itself does not work very well to remove behavioural barriers. We need to do that through these wider economic, infrastructural and other measures. And we need to get the timing right to improve the effectiveness of our interventions as well. So just to flag some further reading, if you're interested in this, I think in the introduction to this webinar, the House of Lords report from just over a year ago was mentioned, in which it was concluded that the government is not doing enough to tackle climate change through behaviour change. There is a massive problem, and there were some fantastic solutions proposed in that. But then also more recently, we were commissioned by the Climate Change Committee to review the evidence on what works to change behaviour in the climate space, and to come up with recommendations for how to incorporate that into policy. And so I've sort of highlighted a lot of those conclusions in my talk, but if you want the long version, that's on the Climate Change Committee website as well. So I will leave it there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. I would clap then. I'm sure other people are doing the same thing, but we can't see them. So we've got lots of interesting questions in the Q&A. I will ask my own first question, because I was thinking while you were talking, I was reminded of a workshop I went to a while ago, where people were suggesting that the term behavior change is maybe not a very useful term, because it suggests that, you know, we need to, the people, the individual consumers are the problem, and they are to blame for the problem. We need to do something to them to make them change their behavior. But you're sort of highlighting that actually perhaps we need to give them, I think you even said specifically, we need to remove the barriers to behavior change. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that. Is it like, using the term behavior change, is it like reinforcing that message that the consumers are to blame and we should do something about them, or are actually all the consumers really positive and we all want to change, but we just need to remove the barriers and enable them and allow them to do what they would like to do?
Yes, thanks for that question. I think it's interesting actually to see how different people define behaviour change. And during the course of the House of Lords inquiry, actually, that I was involved with, that some of these debates really surfaced, because for some people they equate behaviour change with voluntary. I'm choosing to change my behaviour, and so within the scope of the things that I can currently do, these are the things I'm choosing to do. And that might, and that in as far as we might encourage voluntary behaviour change, that might be through information provision. So in other words, in a sense, it was equated with the downstream, really. Actually, we use a much broader definition, and this is actually the definition that was used, adopted in the end in the House of Lords report as well, which is that it's about any measure to get people to do things differently for whatever motive and reason that they might have. So this is actually about enabling people to change their behaviour, not leaving it up to them and saying, here's some information, you know, you can choose to use it or not. It's actually about enabling and motivating people through economic measures, planning measures, regulations, a whole range of different public policy options, not only information provision. So it's the outcome of the policy is that it ends up changing people's behaviour. It's not defined by being a very small subset of behaviour change approaches. And I've also tried to emphasize that actually it isn't even just about the consumer. That's a really important set of behaviors available to change, but actually we can also change behavior in the workplace, in communities and elsewhere. So it is a much broader definition of behavior change.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Right, I'll take some questions from the Q&A. I've got one question here. What your thoughts on how we might be able to involve younger people in the debate, for the future, and how we can make their voices heard. If you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I do think that's really important for the sorts of reasons I highlighted, really, which is that the sort of climate anxiety is higher amongst young people, partly because they do feel disempowered and frustrated, and that's playing into their anxiety about the future that they're going to inherit. So I think we do need to find ways to ensure that their voices are heard in all the contexts in which decisions are being made. Colleagues at the University of Bath actually are doing a lot to try to raise awareness of this and to, for example, also get young people trained to engage more effectively in UN climate decision making in the COP talks. So there is gradually an appreciation within formal decision making contests that young people should have a voice. So, e.g., in COP decision making, but often those young people don't necessarily have the right skills and training. So that is a crucial sort of prerequisite to enable them to really make the most of those opportunities. And yeah, I think more generally, we do just need to sort of find ways in which we can listen to what young people are saying and feeling about this. So I think it's, as researchers as well, it's also about seeing how do different age groups understand and respond to some of these options.
So I've got a very nice specific question here from somebody who's asking a question about the measures of policy support and wondering where people say that they're supportive of a policy, does it actually mean that they want to change their behavior, or would they be happy to pay a little more to make them feel better and then still fly to the other side of the world, for instance?
Yeah, that's another important point, I think, which is that we have to we can't interpret support in the abstract for necessarily people changing their behavior when it comes to implementing some of these policies. So we know there can be a gap between sort of the abstract and the concrete in that sense. So we do see that most people are supportive of a lot of these sorts of policies, but when it comes to implementation, people will also be weighing up, well, how much does this personally cost me, and how much will I be sort of inconvenienced, and where will I benefit? And there will be, and how much do I trust the people implementing this? There will be a lot of other factors that will come into play in terms of them accepting the specific measure, but also changing their own behaviour. So I think that is important to say. And so when it's and so I think it's also about kind of ensuring that there is involving people at the local level in terms of specific schemes, so that they have had a voice in terms of the specifics of, say, a local scheme. And otherwise we risk backlash, for example, as we've seen with transport policies in local areas like ULEZ and some of the clean air zones and low traffic neighbourhoods, for example. So the specifics of the scheme, you have to involve people in the design. And enable people to change their behaviour. So some of the abstract support is contingent on, if you enable me to change my behaviour.
Great, excellent. I've got a question here from somebody who's wondering whether in the work that you've been doing in CAST, you have also looked at the perceptions of policymakers themselves. So, and whether you have any insights into their perceptions of the behaviour change interventions that you've been talking about.
That is a good question. They're all good questions. I think colleagues are starting to look at this. So political science colleagues are interviewing decision makers, policy makers. I think one of the things that seems to be the case about how policymakers think about about behaviour change is that there is. I think sometimes they're just not necessarily aware of the evidence of what works. That's part of it. And that was flagged in the House of Lords report, was that the use of behavioural science within government is patchy at best. In some departments, it's almost absent. And So the skills of civil servants might be sort of mixed in terms of their ability to even think about when a behaviour change approach might apply. But there is also a political dimension here, because I think you saw that in the forward to the net zero strategy, which is there is a squeamishness amongst maybe most parties, but certainly towards the right in particular, in terms of government intervening in people's lives or indeed in business, and that the government should be more hands-off. And so, we'll leave it up to people, to markets, to decide what to do. And so that means that actually there is a lack of desire really at the ideological level to actually change behaviour, which makes it quite difficult to sort of say it is actually required and technology alone is not going to solve anything. We are going to have to change our lifestyles to some extent. So there's a range of challenges, I think, and part of it is getting the evidence into policy, but then there's also, I think, how we frame this in a way that might be less threatening to policymakers, or that might align with their values in some way.
I've got some questions here that maybe sort of tie together a little bit. So a couple of people asking questions about what your suggestions are for where more research is needed or where we need to go next. But there was also some questions around your insight into where should we focus most, what kind of behaviors have the most impact, what behaviors are most likely to have, what should we focus on in terms of creating the biggest impact and have the most effect?
Well, I think that's so in the Climate Change Committee report I mentioned at the end, we come up with a sort of series of recommendations for how to answer those sorts of questions, really, which is, basically how would you prioritize, where to focus in terms of behaviour change measures in climate policy. Part of it is about targeting behaviours that are most impactful. So I mentioned, for example, reducing car use is probably one of the biggest wins. That is really effective to reduce people's carbon emissions, is to cut car use, equally to reduce flying, change diets and energy use. So there are some obvious behaviours that then you could target. But then the other thing to factor in, I think, is around sort of public acceptability and how it might be difficult. The perceptions of fairness are going to be very important. So if you choose something like reducing car use, how can you tackle that in a way that actually does enable people to reduce their car use, does it in a fair way, in terms of kind of thinking about distributions and the polluter pays, giving people a voice in decision making, and maximising co-benefits as well, and communicating those to people. So thinking about how can we do this in a way that improves road safety, that improves air quality, that reduces bills. There are no silver bullets, of course, but in some of the work that we're doing with Welsh Government at the moment, School Streets has come out as quite a nice example of where it ticks an awful lot of boxes and is incredibly popular. So in contrast to things like 20 miles an hour, which is a road safety policy, and in contrast to 15-minute cities and ULEZ, which are maybe about improving air quality, reducing emissions and so on, actually School Streets does all of those things as well, but because it has other hallmarks, it's particularly focused on children's safety and air quality around schools. It's temporary, so it's not all the time that the roads are closed. So there are various things that suggest that actually that might be why they're incredibly popular, just in contrast to similar sorts of policies. So that could be a sort of a low-hanging fruit. Another one I would say is insulation. I think I flagged that actually it is the top co-benefit that people say, this is really important to me as I want to reduce my energy bills. Of course, in a cost of living crisis, we need these sorts of solutions. And so it seems kind of crazy not to do that, which would also massively reduce our carbon emissions within homes. So it's fine and address things like energy security, which was also second most important to people. So there are all these sort of things that seem like they would actually tick an awful lot of these co-benefit boxes, be important to people, be seen as sort of fair and beneficial, but they're not currently necessarily being pursued.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions here. I think they're sort of related to each other. One of them, one person is asking about what do we do to to address those with in the top 10% income bracket that seem to be the least supportive of some of the policies. And somebody else is asking, how do we reach the so-called leaders, those who are most worried about losing their income, their jobs, those are the big polluters, if you like.
Yeah, great questions, difficult questions. On the high income group, this is something that we want to do more. Look at this in the second phase of CAST, which we're hopefully just about to move into, and we've done a bit of thinking. So with my colleague Sam Hampton, he's actually done some interviews and surveys with very wealthy people, many of whom express high levels of climate change concern and have, in many cases, started to adopt some of the actions which are financially out of reach for a lot of other people, like buying an electric vehicle, getting a heat pump. So some of these things, actually, some of the measures to reduce your carbon footprint might be more within the gift of wealthier people. But of course, they need to reduce their carbon footprint much more. So that makes sense. So they have a role there to play, to be an early adopter in some of those technologies. They also might be particularly influential in the workplace. So it's about thinking about what can they do maybe to leverage their influence. So it's about those wider roles that people have. So while they have a particularly high carbon footprint, they also have influence that could shift things across society potentially more effectively. So it is maybe thinking about some of those influence roles that they have. And then in terms of the sort of people, I suppose the vested interests and the people who might stand to lose from a net zero transition, this speaks to, I guess, the need partly about for a just transition. So ensuring that people that are working in, say, fossil fuel industry or livestock agriculture are not left behind, not penalised in the way that we've seen in the past with industrial transitions. So actually a fair transition is going to be critical. But also I think it is about transparency. So where there might be actually lobbying and vested interests that are an impediment to net zero, it is about ensuring that we actually are seeing how these decisions are being made in a way that is more transparent.
Thank you. I've got two questions. I'm going to put them together, even though they're asking almost the opposite. So one person is asking, what do you think is the sort of the key thing that we need to address in order to address the rapid change that we need? So what are the quick wins, or what we need to do now? But then there's also somebody else is asking, actually, a lot of short-term thinking in government doesn't really look at the long-term bigger picture. So what do we need to address long-term thinking? Opposites, but the same question, same problem, and opposite directions.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I've started to answer the quick wins in a way, because I think, I mean, I don't think rolling out insulation actually would be very quick, but I think it would be a sort of a win-win. So in that sense, it would be important to really get into sort of the energy efficiency. We've got a lost 15 years of energy efficiency policy. So I think that would be a priority. I think public procurement is another one, where actually just having the public sector invest in some of the sorts of low carbon services and products. So an example that we asked about in our survey was public provisioning of vegetarian and vegan foods, for example, so that you would have more availability of those sorts of foods in, say, hospitals and schools and so on, so that people would choose those things more, and so there would be the healthcare benefits, by the way, as well as reducing emissions. It would also help drive down prices of those things, because you've got the public sector are buying them, etc. So so that public procurement would be another one. And I touched on nudging as well. I mean, I think there are probably just some really easy nudges that could just be applied all over the place, like defaults are one of the really effective ones. So if you could just move people onto renewable tariffs, if you can, I mean, you'd have to think through some of the designs of some of these things, but I think in some cases there are going to be some fairly simple sort of choice architecture things that could just be put in place almost overnight. So where we know what works, just sort of move ahead with some of those things. And the long-term, I think, element is also another important point. I think this was some of the thinking behind having the Climate Change Committee and having carbon budgets that extend over many years, including sort of beyond current government terms, that actually now we have a legislative framework and that governance structure that is supposed to hold governments to account over that longer term. I think that helps. It's obviously not, it doesn't fully translate into the decision making in the here and now of governments. And I think part of that then is about really showing those win-wins, really demonstrating what are going to be the jobs that are going to arise from net zero, what are going to be the cost savings, etc. And I think actually the Skidmore review did that really well. It really highlighted this is why it just makes sense economically and in terms of social benefits and health and other things to have a net zero transition, even if you don't care about climate change. So I think it's a shame that didn't sort of have more influence, but I think those arguments are quite compelling.
Right, thank you. I have a lot of questions and comments in the chat about people wanting to find out more about some of the things you talked about and reports and references. So I'm guessing we just want to point them to the CAST website, and perhaps you're happy to be contacted as well, or and also, yeah, I think we'll share or maybe collate the chat information as well. And we've only got 3 minutes left, so I'm going to ask just one more question, which I think combines a couple of questions here as well, which is 2 people are asking what your perspectives are on the role of social media and also potentially strong leadership in this leading by example in this kind of debate.
Yes, no. So my colleague Steve Westlake has done some really nice work around sort of what leadership is in this space, and really does show that actually, if people who are influential, whether that be policymakers or more kind of celebrities or people, even sort of community leaders, actually, if they are walking the talk, it makes a big difference. So actually getting people to change their behavior then sends a signal that this is important and that they're taking it seriously. So I do think that is important to be sending those signals. So it matters what people do, not just what they say. And in terms of social media, this is a huge, I think the media in general is about kind of, there's a huge opportunity here to think about kind of how we talk about things like consumption and happiness. Like I talked about the fact that actually going green can make you happy. There's so much that we can talk about, I think, to challenge this myth that going green is about sacrifice. There are lots of win-wins, and I think we can start to sort of change the discourse around some of this. And so media, but also particularly social media, can be really powerful to do that and to have some really persuasive communicators. So it's about who we trust. There's some great work by Climate Outreach, for example, that's looked at who are the trusted messengers on climate change. Of course, David Attenborough comes top across all segments. He's highly trusted. Climate scientists are fairly trusted, but there are other people that I think are within different communities are potentially much more powerful communicators. So I think looking at who are going to be the right people to send the message, as well as how to craft those messages, is important.
Fantastic. Well, our time is up. We took up all the space, so sorry about the questions that we didn't get to answer. Thank you very much, Lorraine, for this fascinating talk. Thank you very much, everyone, for asking questions, and continue the debate. So hopefully this was it sparked lots of new thoughts and debates. So yeah, thank you very much.